The coastal town of Seaside, Oregon, has always had a peaceful atmosphere. It was especially picturesque in the fall, when the cool ocean breeze painted the cheeks of the locals with a gentle blush, and the fallen leaves carpeted the quiet streets with a golden carpet. The air itself seemed saturated with salt, and the anticipation of change that this time of year brings. Astrid Kingsley loved autumn more than any other season. Every morning she opened the windows of her office in the town library, breathing in the salty air mixed with the aroma of coffee from the nearby coffee shop. Her desk, littered with books in need of restoration, was always turned so that she could see both the sea and the main street of the city. At such moments, she felt a special connection to the city, as if she were part of its unhurried breath. The library had become her refuge years ago when she first moved to Seaside. The old red brick building with its tall arched windows held the stories of generations of locals. Astrid knew every creaking floorboard, every crack in the ceiling, every book on the shelves. Here she felt truly alive. This year, the fall brought a change. The Rossi family had moved in next door to Kingsley's house. Dominic, a successful surgeon, had transferred to the local hospital from Seattle, bringing with him a reputation for brilliance and many boxes of books. His daughter Piper, a quiet 16-year-old girl with expressive brown eyes, immediately attracted Astrid's attention with her reading and a peculiar hidden sadness in her gaze. Their first meeting had been on a rainy Tuesday when Piper had come to the library to get materials for a school project on English literature. Astrid noticed the girl pensively paging through the spines of books in the classic poetry section, occasionally wiping her fogged glasses with the edge of her sweater. There was the same caution in her movements that Astrid had once used to touch the books herself, afraid to spook the stories lurking in them. "Are you looking for something specific?" Astrid asked then, and that simple question started their conversation. Piper looked up, and something akin to gratitude for the broken solitude flashed in her eyes. At home, Astrid's life was slowly losing color. Aidan, her husband, was staying at work more and more often, immersed in the development of his investment company. His passion for money grew in proportion to his distance from his wife. He spent every evening in his home office, taking notes with his favorite fountain pen, a gift from his father, the ink for which he ordered from Italy and refilled himself, considering it his own little ritual. At these moments he seemed especially distant, as if he were not in the next room, but on another continent. Their once cozy home had become a space filled with silence and reticence. Astrid couldn't remember the last time they'd had dinner together, or talked about anything other than bills and social events. The pictures of their wedding hanging on the walls seemed like snapshots from someone else's life. More and more often she lingered in the library, finding solace in books and conversation with Piper, who now stopped by almost every day. They could spend hours discussing what they had read, sitting in the far corner of the reading room. Piper would share her thoughts on Virginia Woolf and the Bronte sisters, and Astrid would listen, amazed at the depth of her young companion's judgment. At such moments, the difference in age became imperceptible. They were just two kindred spirits who had found each other among the bookshelves. On one of these evenings, when the October wind was driving the clouds over Seaside, Astrid found herself waiting for these meetings with an inexplicable excitement. She tried to push these thoughts away, writing it all off as loneliness and professional interest in an intelligent interlocutor. But deep inside, she realized that this was the beginning of something more, something forbidden. Every glance, every casual touch of her hands over the pages of the book carried a danger that she preferred not to notice. October turned to November, and dense fogs enveloped the coastal town. On such days, the library seemed especially cozy. The old building with its stained glass windows seemed to shut out visitors from the outside world, creating a special space where time slowed down. Piper now spent all her free time here. She favored the far corner of the reading room, where there was a worn leather sofa and a floor lamp with a green lampshade. Astrid often found her there with a book by Virginia Woolf, or a volume by Sylvia Plath. At such moments she would stare at the girl's profile in the soft light, admiring the way she frowned her eyebrows as she immersed herself in her reading. Their conversations became more and more frank. After the library closed, they could spend hours discussing what they'd read, sharing their innermost thoughts. Piper talked about her old life in Seattle, about her mother who had left her family 2 years ago, about feeling lonely at her new school. Astrid shared her worries about a marriage that had become a formality. One day, as the first snow covered Seaside in a white blanket, they met in the city park. Piper had arrived early and was waiting on a bench by the pond, wrapped in a voluminous scarf. Astrid had brought a thermos of hot cocoa and homemade cookies. They sat shoulder to shoulder, watching the snowflakes dance in the lantern light. At one point, their fingers touched, and neither pulled away. At home, Astrid caught increasingly suspicious glances from her husband. Aiden became irritable, his pedantry growing into a mania for control. He demanded accountability for every dollar spent, checked phone calls, insisted on dinners together, during which silence was interrupted only by the sound of cutlery and the squeak of his eternal fountain pen. He never parted with his daily planner, even at the table. Dominique Rossi also noticed the change in his daughter's behavior. Her sudden enthusiasm for the library had pleased him at first. Piper had seemed depressed after the move, and he was glad for any sign that she was beginning to settle in. But something in her detached look, in the way she answered his questions in a hurry, made him uneasy. In mid-December, Astrid and Piper began meeting at a small coffee shop in a neighboring town where no one knew them. They would pick a table in the far corner, order hot chocolate, and talk about everything in the world. On one of those days, Piper gently touched Astrid's hand and confessed that she had never felt so close to another person before. Astrid knew she had to stop it. For her own sake, for Piper's sake, for their families. But every time she tried to distance herself, something irresistible pulled her back. She started keeping a journal, trusting paper with what she couldn't say out loud. She hid the written pages in an old shoebox on the top shelf of her closet. On Christmas Eve, when the whole town was ablaze with holiday lights, they kissed for the first time. It happened in the vault of the library, among dusty folios and the smell of old books. The kiss was weightless, almost ghostly, but it changed everything. They both realized there was no going back. That evening, when she returned home, Astrid stood under the hot shower for a long time, trying to wash away the guilt. And in the neighboring house, Dominique Rossi, noticing the strange glint in his daughter's eyes, for the first time seriously thought that something inexplicable was happening. January was unusually cold for Oregon. The ocean was raging, crashing waves against the coastal rocks, as if foreshadowing the coming storm in the lives of the inhabitants of quiet Seaside. White lambs of foam flew over the gray water, and the wind blew through the windows of the houses with such force that it seemed as if the glass was about to fail. Aiden Kingsley was spending more and more time at home, having unexpectedly canceled several important business trips. His office, usually closed, was now often empty, and he appeared at the most unexpected moments, either in the library on the pretext of lunch with his wife, or in the city park during his supposedly random jogs. His demeanor had the alertness of a predator who had smelled prey. He began to notice details that had previously escaped his attention. How Astrid's voice changed during phone calls, how she furtively checked messages, how she flinched at his touch. On one such day, he noticed Astrid hastily hiding her phone when he appeared. That was the final straw. That evening, while she was showering, Aiden broke their unspoken rule about personal space for the first time. In the bedroom, methodically going through her things, he came across a shoebox. The diary hidden there revealed all of his wife's secrets. Each page was like a stabbing blow. With each line he read, his hands trembled more and more. He spent all night in his study, methodically transcribing passages from the diary with his fountain pen, leaving ink stains in the margins. Aiden had always prided himself on his self-control, but now an uncontrollable rage was boiling up inside him. The perfect world he had so carefully built over the years was crumbling before his eyes. At the same time, Dominique Rossi began to notice strange changes in Piper's behavior. Her grades at school were getting worse. She was skipping music school, and she was responding to his questions with increasing irritation. It was as if another person had taken up residence in his daughter. Secretive, nervous, constantly slipping away from the conversation. One morning, looking at her phone bill, he found hundreds of messages sent to the same number late at night. The denouement came on a February evening when a particularly heavy snowfall hit the city. Astrid stayed late at the library, as she often did lately. Piper was due later. They'd agreed to meet after closing time, when only the night watchman would be left in the building, dozing in his den at the entrance. The dim light from the desk lamp cast bizarre shadows on the walls of the office. Aiden appeared suddenly, as if materializing out of the thickening shadows. He entered his wife's office without knocking, holding her journal. There were ink stains on his impeccably pressed shirt. He'd clutched his pen so hard it had leaked. There was something frightening, inhuman in his eyes. "I know everything." His voice was unaccustomedly calm, almost affectionate. "About you and that girl, about your meetings, about everything." Each word fell like a stone into the silence. Astrid froze at the window like a statue. The wet snow was falling behind the glass, and in the reflection she saw her husband's face contorted with anger. On the table was a silk scarf, Piper's Christmas present. Its soft blue color seemed inappropriately bright in the darkness of the office. At that moment, Piper herself appeared in the doorway, frozen like a frightened doe. She didn't know what was happening, but she instinctively sensed danger. Aiden turned slowly toward her, his lips curved into a strange smile, more like a grin. The next few minutes merged into some crazy kaleidoscope of a nightmare. Screams, accusations, and the sound of breaking glass tore through the familiar silence of the library. Astrid tried to defend Piper, begging her to leave. Aiden waved the journal around, reading passages aloud, his voice breaking into a scream. At one point, he grabbed a scarf off the table, a move so quick that no one had time to react. When the night watchman, attracted by the noise, finally reached the study, it was too late. Astrid's body was lying on the floor, her silk scarf draped around her neck, stained with ink. A broken fountain pen lay nearby, the last witness to the tragedy. Piper was nowhere to be found. She'd run away in a panic, leaving a trail of footprints in the freshly fallen snow. Aiden sat at his wife's desk, methodically making notes in his day planner as if nothing had happened. Fresh ink stains blurred on his cuffs, traces of his crime that could never be erased. Detective Meredith Thorne arrived on the scene around midnight. Wet snow was still falling, turning the ground around the library into a muddy mess. Police lights reflected in the stained glass windows, painting the ancient building in ghostly red and blue tones. Steam from the officer's breath rose in the frosty air, creating bizarre halos around them. A heavy odor of ink hung in the air, mixed with the metallic tang of blood. The first thing that caught the detective's eye in the librarian's office was the perfect order. Despite the signs of struggle, all the books were in their proper places, and the papers on the desk were neatly stacked, as if someone had made a special effort to give the crime scene a semblance of normalcy. Astrid Kingsley's body had already been taken away, but the dark stain on the carpet still held the outlines of the tragedy. "What do we have?" Thorne asked the young officer taking notes by the door. Her experienced eye had already noted a few oddities. Papers folded too neatly, books unnaturally flat on the shelf, as if someone had arranged them after a struggle. The picture of the crime was beginning to come together piece by piece, like a grim mosaic. The night watchman, Harold Wilcox, a gray-haired man with frightened eyes, heard the noise around 9 o'clock at night. When he went up to the second floor, he found Aiden Kingsley sitting quietly at a table next to his wife's body. He answered questions in one-word answers, showing no emotion, as if the events were of no concern to him. Lieutenant Bryce, entering the office, left wet footprints on the parquet behind him. "Mr. Kingsley insists on his innocence," he reported, holding out a preliminary report to Thorne. "Claims he came to talk to his wife and found her already dead, holding unnaturally calm." Thorne nodded, looking at the photograph on the table. Astrid Kingsley was smiling into the lens, holding some sort of award. The picture had been taken recently, judging by the date on the frame, only a month ago. She looked happy and full of life. There was something in her eyes that Thorne couldn't quite capture, some secret joy, maybe a forbidden happiness. The next 48 hours turned into an endless kaleidoscope of interrogations and examinations. Dominic Rossi, Kingsley's neighbor, a tall man with the tired eyes of a surgeon, described his daughter's strange behavior in recent months. His hands, accustomed to the precision of a scalpel, nervously rubbed the sleeve of his jacket as he spoke of the changes in Piper. Piper herself wasn't found until the morning. She was hiding at her school friend's house, in a state of deep shock. The girl was pale as a sheet, she was shaking, and she refused to talk about what had happened, only repeating Astrid's name like a prayer. "She spent a lot of time in the library," Rossi said, tapping his fingers nervously on the table in the interrogation room. His voice shook with restrained emotion. "I thought it was a good thing. Thought she was finally adjusting after the move. I should have noticed, should have realized." Thorne was particularly interested in the diary found in Kingsley's bedroom. The pages were written in Astrid's small, hurried handwriting, as if she was afraid she wouldn't have time to express her thoughts. The last entry was dated the day of the murder, the ink not yet completely dry. "I can't pretend anymore. Today I'm going to tell Aiden the truth about my feelings for Piper. I'd rather let it end right away than continue living a lie. I know he'll be furious, but I have to be honest, first and foremost with myself." The office was getting colder, someone had left the window ajar, and the February wind raced scraps of papers across the floor. Thorne shivered, looking out at the night city outside the window. Somewhere out there, in the maze of snow-covered streets, hid the answers to her questions. "Check all the city's camera footage," she ordered, lifting the collar of her coat. "Especially pay attention to the coffee shops in the neighboring town. I have a feeling we're missing something." Her intuition, honed by years of service, told her this case was more complicated than it seemed at first glance. By the end of the first week of the investigation, Detective Thorne had plunged into the Kingsley family's past like a dark pool. Behind the flawless facade of their marriage hid cracks that became more and more obvious with each new testimony. The story, which at first seemed a simple drama of jealousy, grew with new details, each of which added depth to the tragedy. Astrid's colleagues at the library, one by one passing through the interrogation room, painted a portrait of a woman on the cusp of change. Martha Sheldon, head of the children's department, recalled how Astrid began bringing in fresh flowers, timidly at first, one or two stems, then increasingly lush bouquets. "It was like she was blooming herself," Martha said, rubbing her handkerchief. "Started wearing brightly colored scarves, often hummed when she thought no one could hear her." James Patterson, an elderly librarian in the rare books department, noted another. "You know, she started spending more time in the poetry section. Often ordered new editions of contemporary poetry, though she used to prefer the classics. And this girl, Piper, they could talk for hours about a particular poetry book, but all the staff spoke with one voice about the drastic change in Astrid's behavior when her husband appeared. It was as if a shadow came over her face. Her movements became stiff, her voice quieter. She froze like a bird before a snake, was how Martha Sheldon described it. Piper's interrogation took place in the presence of a psychologist. The girl sat with her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to protect herself from an invisible threat. Her father, Dr. Rossi, nervously paced the hallway outside the door, while the lawyer made notes in a notebook. "We were just talking about books," Piper repeated, and her voice shook. "First about Virginia Woolf. I was writing a report on Mrs. Dalloway, then about Sylvia Plath." Astrid understood what the poems were about, really understood. She fell silent, swallowing her tears, then continued. We never meant to hurt anyone. But can you control feelings?" The testimony of Wilcox's night watchman added a new touch to Aiden Kingsley's portrait. The old man remembered that night vividly. A week before the murder, he'd noticed a light in the library window around midnight. "I went up to check, thought maybe one of the staff had forgotten to turn off the lamp, and there was Mr. Kingsley, sitting at his wife's desk, looking for something in the drawers. Said Astrid had asked me to pick up some papers. Forensics, who studied the CCTV footage, have reconstructed the chronology of the day of the murder. Aiden Kingsley left his office at 3 p.m., 4 hours earlier than usual. His silver Mercedes was parked across the street from the library. Cameras recorded him sitting there for hours without turning off the engine. He was obviously waiting for someone, Lieutenant Bryce suggested, reviewing the footage. Or daring someone to do something. Thorne returned to the crime scene again and again, as if trying to grasp something that had escaped her attention. The scarf that had been the murder weapon was wrapped in holiday paper with reindeer and snowflakes, a Christmas gift from Piper. The box contained a card written in children's handwriting. "Astrid, thank you for showing me the world of poetry. Love, P." The medical examiner's report was accurate. Death was caused by strangulation between 9 and 10:30 in the evening. The struggle was short-lived. Astrid's body showed signs of a severe blow to the head, possibly against the edge of a table, which had partially stunned her. The ink stains on the scarf were the decisive evidence. The lab did a thorough analysis. The ink was a rare brand made in a small workshop in Florence. Aidan ordered them every 3 months. His secretary, Mary Collins, confirmed. Mr. Kingsley was very meticulous about such things, said only this ink gave the right shade of blue. Kingsley's housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, who worked in their home for 15 years, confirmed. He wouldn't let anyone touch his pens. He refilled the ink himself, cleaned it himself. He had a special box for it, mahogany, inlaid. The picture of the crime was becoming clearer and clearer, like a photograph appearing in a dark room. But it never left Thorne with the feeling that they were seeing only the surface. Behind every statement, behind every piece of evidence, she saw a deeper meaning. She went back to Astrid's diary, rereading the last entries. There was the desperation of a woman cornered by her own feelings, and at the same time, the determination to change everything. "Maybe it's crazy," Astrid wrote a week before her death, "but isn't love always a little crazy? I know I'm hurting everyone I love, but I hurt myself even more by continuing to live this lie." Thorne closed her journal and walked to the window. Snow was falling behind the glass, covering the evidence of the crime, but she knew the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find its way to the light. 2 weeks later, Detective Thorne sat at her desk with the case files spread out in front of her. Crime scene photos, interrogation reports, expert reports. Every document had been studied dozens of times. Now, all the evidence pointed to one man. Aidan Kingsley sat in the interrogation room, still impeccably dressed, his hair perfectly styled. His fountain pen lay on the table in front of him. He had insisted on being allowed to take notes. "Mr. Kingsley," Thorne began, "let's reconstruct the events of that evening. You came into the library about 9 o'clock. I already told you." His voice sounded flat. "I wanted to talk to my wife. After you found her diary," Thorne placed a familiar notebook on the table, "you read about her relationship with Piper Rossi, about how she was going to confess everything to you." For the first time in the entire interrogation, Aidan trembled. His fingers clenched the pen so hard his knuckles turned white. "You waited in the car in front of the library for hours, saw Piper come in, went up to the study, and when Astrid admitted she loved another man, a 16-year-old girl, you lost control." Thorne spread the crime scene photos on the table. An ink-stained scarf, signs of a struggle, an overturned chair. Interesting that this particular scarf happened to be on hand. A gift from Piper. Symbolic, isn't it? Aidan was silent, mechanically twirling his pen in his fingers. Ink dripped onto the interrogation report, blurring into an ugly stain. "You know what the worst part is?" He finally looked up. "I loved her. All these years I did everything I could to make her happy. And she, with a baby." His confession was recorded from first to last word. An hour later, Aidan's lawyer was already negotiating the terms of the plea deal. Piper and her father left Seaside a month after the trial. Dominic found a job at a hospital in Portland, far from the city, where every corner reminded him of the tragedy. The girl was going to have to work long hours with a psychologist to deal with the trauma. The library remained closed for a week after the murder. When it reopened, there was a sign on Astrid's desk with her name and dates of life. Every day, someone brought fresh flowers. Aidan Kingsley received 15 years in prison. At his last court hearing, he looked a decade older. His famous fountain pen remained in the evidence bag, a key piece of evidence that linked him to the murder through unique ink stains on his scarf. Detective Thorne had often thought about this case, about how love can turn into obsession and control into cruelty, how society judges those who don't fit in, and about a woman whose only fault was that she dared to love the wrong person. On the last day of the trial, Thorne found a book in her office, a Virginia Woolf tome that Astrid had once given to Piper. It had an inscription on the front: "Sometimes you have to have the courage to be yourself, even when the whole world is against it." The case was closed, but its echoes echoed long afterward in the quiet streets of a seaside town where no one believed in the serenity of still waters anymore. Piper Rossi graduated from Portland High School a year after the events at Seaside. Her graduate essay in literature received the highest grade. She wrote about Sylvia Plath and the nature of pain in poetry. Teachers noted the unusual depth of analysis for a 17-year-old girl. In the text, she drew parallels between personal tragedies and their creative reinterpretation, each word ringing with barely restrained emotion. The last time she came to Seaside was the summer before she started college. The town hadn't changed much, still the same sound of the surf, still smelled of salt and coffee from that coffee shop on the corner. The library stood with a new sign, but the stained glass windows were still the same. The sun played in the colored panes, casting iridescent spots on the stone steps. She didn't go inside, just stood at the entrance, looking at the steps, worn by thousands of footsteps. Somewhere on the second floor, another librarian was working now, maybe also putting fresh flowers on the table and helping other teens find the right books. From the open windows came the familiar smell of old books mixed with the aroma of coffee. Piper walked along the boardwalk where she and Astrid had once walked, discussing what they had read. Taking a seat on their favorite bench, she pulled out a notebook. She'd started keeping a journal almost immediately after moving to Portland. The therapist had said it would help her deal with the trauma. Over time, the short notes turned into real essays. At her father's house, Piper found a box of old things. She had packed them herself before the move, without even looking through them. Among the notebooks and photographs was a tattered volume of poetry, a Christmas present from Astrid. There was an inscription on the front: "Piper, never stop looking for the beauty in words, A.K." The handwriting was hurried, as if Astrid was afraid she wouldn't have time to say something important. In college, she had chosen journalism over literature. "I want to write about real people and their stories," she explained to her father. Dominic only nodded. He had learned to accept his daughter's choice, whatever it was. After Seaside, their relationship changed, became deeper, more honest. They learned to talk about difficult things without hiding their eyes. Her first serious article appeared in the university newspaper. She wrote about violence in families, about how society chooses to overlook the obvious, about how hard it is to be yourself in a world where everyone only wants to see the convenient version of the truth. The article was reprinted by several local publications. The editor of the city newspaper offered her a regular column. During her freshman year, she began attending a support group for survivors of trauma. There, she met others just as broken and just as strong. They shared stories, cried, laughed, and learned to live again. Gradually, Piper realized her experience, however painful, had given her a special perspective on the world. Detective Thorne had called her after the first article was published. They hadn't spoken since that interrogation, but Meredith had been following the girl's fate through mutual acquaintances. They met at the same coffee shop where Piper had once sat with Astrid. "Are you okay?" Thorne asked without preamble. "Yeah," Piper replied. And it wasn't a lie. For the first time in a long time. They talked for several hours. Meredith talked about her other cases, about the importance of not losing faith in justice. Piper listened and realized that was what she wanted to write about people who didn't give up. She hadn't forgotten Astrid. She hadn't forgotten their conversations about books, hadn't forgotten the warmth of her smile and the way she could listen, really listen, as if every word mattered. But those memories didn't hurt now. They had become part of her story, part of who she had become. At 23, Piper published her first novel, a love story that didn't fit into conventional frameworks. She wrote it at night, after working at the newspaper, reliving each scene anew. Critics praised her for her honesty and lack of moralizing. The book did not become a bestseller, but it found its reader. Letters from teenagers who recognized in the characters themselves, she kept in a special folder. On the last page of the novel was a short acknowledgement, AK, for the courage to be yourself. Only Dominic Rossi, after reading these lines, silently hugged his daughter and did not let go for a long time. In his office at the Portland hospital was a picture of Piper with the first copy of the book. She smiled at the camera, holding the volume in her hands, just like Astrid once did in that picture in the library. Piper had learned to live with the story. She was no longer that scared little girl frozen in the library doorway. She had become a woman who knew the value of words and knew how to find light in even the darkest of stories. There were always fresh flowers on her desk, and on the shelf, among other books, was the very same volume of poetry with Astrid's inscription, a reminder that love can take many forms, and each one is worthy of being told. Every year on Astrid's birthday, she brought a bouquet of wildflowers to the doorstep of the library in Seaside. No note, no explanation, just a token of remembrance of the woman who taught her the most important thing: to be real, no matter what.